Hello everyone, how are you today? Welcome to the MudRoom, our weekly free uncommon sense parenting class. How is everyone today? June is a super busy month for our family. We had my mom's birthday last weekend. Owen's birthday is coming up next week. It's my wedding anniversary this Friday, although my husband isn't here, so we won't get to celebrate. We've been married for 11 years, so I'm used to it by now. We're 2 weeks away from the kids finishing school local to us. There's just so much going on. We're going to get right into it today because this is somewhat of a big topic that I'd like to give it as much space as I can because we're talking about the difference between inclusion and integration. These are two terms. Hello everyone, how are you today? Welcome to the MudRoom, our weekly free uncommon sense parenting class. How's everyone today? June is a super busy month for our family. We had my mom's birthday last weekend. Owen's birthday is coming up next week. It's my wedding anniversary this Friday, although my husband isn't here, so we won't get to celebrate it yet again. We've been married for 11 years. Thankfully, I'm used to it by now. We're 2 weeks away from the kids local to us finishing school. There's just a lot going on. So we're going to get right into it today because this is somewhat of a big topic and I'd like to give it as much space as I can because we're talking about the difference between inclusion and integration. These are two terms that you're going to start hearing a lot once your child enters any kind of institutional care situation like daycare, preschool, or if your child in your life has a disability. And they're important terms to understand whether your children are typical or not. Because when it comes to child care and care reform and policy, the more numerous voices there are and the louder voices there are get their demands met. And often the parents of the children who have disabilities are seen as being self-serving when they highlight inequities. So it's an especially important term to understand these concepts as parents of typical kids because it allows you to be an ally and to put your children in environments that are most beneficial to all kids. Before we get into it though, allow me to introduce myself if you're new around here. Hi, my name is Alana Robinson and I'm a parenting coach for parents of toddlers, preschoolers, and kindergartners. I help you understand why your children are misbehaving and how to fix it without yelling, shaming, or timeouts. I'm your host here on the MudRoom. I'm also the host of the Parenting Posse Facebook group, and I'm the creator of the Parentability program where I help you raise well-behaved kids of your own. If you're watching, say hi, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss another class. Okay, so there's two terms here, inclusion and integration. Many daycares and preschools will use these terms interchangeably. They are not the same, and they have huge impacts on your child's experience and on the experience of children with disabilities. So first, let's talk about integration. Integration means that children with differences, generally we're talking about differences in abilities, but it can also apply to race, gender, ethnicity, religious beliefs, social class or income bracket, etc. Children who differ from the demographic majority are allowed to join the program as it is established, but the program is not going to be altered to reflect their presence. Often, this little graphic here is used to demonstrate integration where they're in the program. The big circle is the program, but within the program, they're still separated from the rest of the typical kids. A common example of this is a classroom where Christian holidays are celebrated with a lot of fanfare, and the children who aren't Christian are expected to either partake anyways or remove themselves. Their holidays are maybe at best mentioned, but they certainly aren't celebrated. A historical example of integration would be in the southern United States when segregation was being eliminated and Black children were allowed to go to quote-unquote white schools, but they were still in a different classroom. They had different water fountains, they had different sports teams and bathrooms. They were in the same space, but they were still separate within that space. An example of it relating to disability is pulling children out of the classroom to do speech therapy or take regulation breaks while the rest of the class just continues. Nothing has been changed to meet that child's needs. They're allowed to exist in the space as long as they can do everything the way the rest of the kids can. As soon as they can't, they're separated out. Inclusion, on the other hand, refers to the program being built around and altered to meet the needs of all of the children in the program, and I do mean all. So rather than just Christian holidays being celebrated, all families are asked to submit their high holidays and are consulted with and asked to share their traditions around celebrating those holidays with the class as a whole. And not like we talk about it for 10 minutes during circle time. On the same level as Christmas and Easter and all of that. An example of inclusion that is slowly but steadily taking hold is people stating their preferred pronouns so that everybody, whether they're cisgender or LGBTQ+, are being called by their proper pronouns. That's altering how the program is designed so that everybody is on equal footing. If a child needs to take breaks for sensory diet or they're working on speech sounds, that's something the entire classroom participates in and becomes embedded in their routine as a whole. The unofficial mantra of inclusion is, if it's good for one kid, it's good for all the kids. This is the graphic that's typically used to explain inclusion. Same program, big circle, but there's no separation. The children with differences are dispersed throughout the program without differentiation from the rest of the kids. When I was in early intervention, a large part of my job was supporting the children being included in daycares, preschools, or kindergartens. And it was rough, because often a program would say they were on board with inclusion, but when it came time to actually alter their program to support all the children in the room, there was a lot of resistance. One example was a little girl that I worked with for several years who has Down syndrome. Her family had experience with the preschool they sent her to, their typical older daughter had attended, and the school assured the parents that yes, they were more than willing to include their younger daughter, and at first they welcomed me and her with what appeared to be open arms. She used a lot of sign language, and we taught all the kids signs so that they could easily communicate with her. We added visuals and picture exchange for her. All of the children used them. All of those surface level things were fairly simple. But when it came to altering the routine to give her sensory breaks, things started to break down. The teacher didn't feel that it was necessary to give all the children sensory breaks, quote unquote, when they didn't need it. We were banished to another room for breaks, which meant that she missed a lot of the programming. And then one day we had an incident that was rather small objectively, but turned into this mushroom cloud. So this little girl couldn't use a pencil, which wasn't a big deal. She was only 4 years old. One of the side effects of Down syndrome is often low muscle tone, meaning that she had difficulty with moderating the force of her muscles, with her muscle gradation. And using a pencil requires you to do two things at once. You have to be able to push down on it and move it at the same time, which she couldn't do. She could either push on the pencil, but then she was unable to move it, or she could move it, but she couldn't push at the same time, so it didn't make a mark. Again, not a big deal for a 4-year-old. And it was preschool, so they didn't do a whole lot of tabletop work anyways. Until after Christmas break. And suddenly the teacher got this bee in her bonnet that the children would be expected to write their names in pencil in kindergarten, so they had to start doing it now to prepare. Which I can and have ranted on in and of itself, but I won't go into now. I've already done a few episodes on why earlier is not better. So knowing this was not a standard my client could or would be held to, I brought in some of those thin pencil-shaped markers for her to use to mark her own work. But of course, kids being kids, they all wanted to use the markers. And I didn't see the issue. For a typical child, the fine motor task of using a marker versus using a pencil is exactly the same. And I confirmed that with the occupational therapist on my team. But the teacher absolutely freaked out. She made a big show of removing the markers and told me that if she couldn't use a pencil like everybody else, that she had to go do her work on the opposite side of the classroom so as not to disrupt or distract the other children. She talked a good game about being inclusive initially, but when push came to shove, she just wanted this little girl to be integrated. She had no desire to alter the program to include her in every aspect of the program, even when those changes were as minor as giving the children the option of using a pencil or a marker to mark their work. The difference between inclusion and integration can seem very small when we talk about it objectively like this, but the impact of those small differences on the program and how they are run is massive. And they send really strong messages to the children participating in the program. It's the difference between seeing them as just differences, alternatives, and them being singled out for their differences and being showed as less than for their differences, something to be ridiculed, something that makes a child an other. And it really sets the tone for the entire program because, as I said, inclusion impacts so many areas, not just disability. So when we're looking at programs, it's important that we not only ask if the program is inclusive, but to ask for actual examples of how they have altered the program in the past to include various differences. Because the way they answer that question can be incredibly telling about the philosophy of the program as a whole, but also about how they will handle your child's needs when they vary from the pack. And as I said in the beginning, it's not until we, the parents of typical children, ask about inclusion and insist on details about how that's accomplished, that it will become a priority for more programs. In my experience, when parents of children who require inclusion ask about it, it's met with a certain level of contempt. They're viewed as wanting special treatment or attention. But when parents of typical kids ask about inclusion, not because their child needs it, but because they want to ensure that all of their children's peers are being given the support that they need to fully participate in a meaningful way, because that benefits our children directly, that it's actually taken seriously. And it does benefit your typical child, even if your child doesn't directly require it. Because if all the kids in the class are getting their needs met, if they all feel like they belong and are valued, that eliminates pretty much all misbehavior. There's very few, if any, bullies. There's very few behavior problems. There's just an inclusive, supportive group of kids who are all working together and looking out for each other. So I hope that that has given you something to think about while you search for a daycare or preschool for your child, while you vet extracurricular activities and camps. I know it's a lot to wrap your head around, and there are so many different aspects to it, so if you need to clarify a point or expand on something or have questions about what this looks like in your context, come and join us in the Parenting Posse, and the community would love to talk about it with you. The link for that is in the description. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'll see you next week for another Uncommon Sense Parenting class. Bye!